My name is Joaquin Morales, and I'm a courier who survived the first 3 months of the Ice Age apocalypse. When Yellowstone erupted in July 2025, I thought it was just another delivery day in Denver. I was wrong. The ash blocked out the sun, civilization collapsed in weeks, and suddenly my motorcycle routes became escape paths from armed gangs hunting survivors. I had to choose between my independence and protecting the people who trusted me. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. My name is Joaquin Morales, but everyone called me Quinn. I was an independent courier in Denver, Colorado, and I knew every shortcut, every back alley, every service tunnel from Colorado Springs to Fort Collins. My modified Yamaha FJ Roan 1300 was my lifeline, equipped with extended fuel capacity, reinforced frame, and hidden storage compartments that most people never noticed. I built my reputation on three things: speed, reliability, and a no-questions-asked policy that kept premium clients coming back. Before the world froze over, I handled the deliveries that other couriers wouldn't touch. Time-sensitive legal documents between law firms, medical samples that needed to reach laboratories within hours, encrypted drives for tech companies, and occasionally packages that came with extra cash and instructions to forget where I picked them up. My encrypted satellite phone never stopped buzzing with jobs, and my leather jacket with armor plating had seen me through everything from Denver traffic to late-night runs through questionable neighborhoods. I lived for the independence of it all. No boss telling me when to work, no office politics, no schedule except the one I made for myself. My mother in Tucson always worried about my lifestyle, but I told her the same thing I told everyone. I knew these roads like my own heartbeat, just like my father had known his trucking routes before he disappeared when I was 16. The difference was I wasn't going anywhere. That was July 15th, 2025, the day everything I thought I knew about survival became worthless. I was sitting in the lobby of Morrison and Associates, a high-end law firm in downtown Denver, waiting for a partner to sign off on a rush delivery to Colorado Springs. The package felt heavier than usual, sealed with some kind of industrial tape I hadn't seen before, and marked with symbols that looked almost military. The receptionist kept glancing at her computer screen with this worried expression, and I could hear raised voices coming from the conference room down the hall. That's when the news alert came through on every phone in the building at once. Yellowstone had erupted. At first, nobody really understood what that meant. The news anchors were calling it a significant geological event, talking about potential travel disruptions and recommending people avoid the Yellowstone area. The law firm partners came rushing out of their conference room, and I heard fragments of conversations about contingency plans and emergency protocols. One of them was on the phone saying something about government contracts and asking if Phase 1 was still operational. I should have paid more attention to that conversation, but I was focused on getting paid and getting on the road. The partner signed my delivery confirmation with shaking hands and told me the package was going to the NORAD facility near Colorado Springs. He emphasized that time was critical, more critical than I might realize, and he paid me triple my usual rate in cash. When someone pays triple rate without negotiating, you know something serious is happening. The ride south started normal enough, but about 30 minutes in, I noticed my GPS acting strange. The signal kept cutting in and out, and my satellite phone was getting interference I'd never experienced before. The sky was getting darker too, not like storm clouds, but like someone was slowly dimming the lights on the whole world. By the time I reached the outskirts of Colorado Springs, there was ash falling like snow, even though it was the middle of July. The NORAD facility was buzzing with activity. Military vehicles everywhere, personnel in hazmat suits, and a tension in the air that made my skin crawl. I delivered to government facilities before, but this was different. People were moving with the kind of urgency that comes right before something terrible happens. When I handed over the package, the receiving officer didn't just sign for it. He opened it right there and examined the contents, which looked like some kind of technical specifications or blueprints. As he was reviewing the documents, I overheard a conversation between two people in military uniforms. One of them was saying, "The models were all wrong. This is going to be much worse than we thought. We need to accelerate the timeline." The other one replied, "How much worse?" The first person just shook his head and said, "Civilization ending worse. We have maybe weeks, not months." I got out of there as fast as I could, but those words stuck with me during the entire ride back to Denver. Civilization ending worse. What did that even mean? I'd lived through economic crashes, natural disasters, even a few personal situations that felt like the end of the world at the time. But this was something different. This was people who had access to information I didn't, and they were scared in a way that made my courier instincts scream that something was very, very wrong. Over the next week, my regular delivery route started changing in subtle ways. Airports began limiting flights, then canceling them entirely. My dispatcher, Maria, who had been coordinating courier jobs in the Denver area for 15 years, started getting nervous in a way I'd never seen before. She kept getting calls from clients asking about emergency protocols and whether we had contingency plans for extended service disruptions. The temperature drops became noticeable by the end of that first week. It was July, peak summer in Colorado, but I needed my jacket by noon every day. The ash in the air was getting thicker, and people on the streets were starting to wear masks and scarves over their faces. The local news was still calling it a temporary climate disruption, but the national news was starting to use words like unprecedented and potentially long-term. My courier network, the informal group of drivers and messengers who shared information about road conditions and job opportunities, became something like an intelligence system. We started sharing information that was more serious than usual traffic updates. Jake, who worked airport runs, told me they weren't just limiting civilian flights anymore. They weren't letting them leave at all. Something about airspace restrictions and national security concerns. Another courier, Lisa, who specialized in medical deliveries, said hospitals were getting shipments of supplies that looked more like disaster preparedness than normal medical inventory. Generators, water purification tablets, emergency food supplies, and medications for treating exposure and hypothermia. In July, in Colorado, I started getting delivery requests that were stranger than anything I'd handled before. Government facilities I'd never heard of, locations that required security clearance verification, packages that came with instructions about handling protocols and chain of custody documentation. Every single one of these jobs paid premium rates, and every single client emphasized speed and discretion above everything else. One delivery took me to a facility built into the mountains west of Denver that I didn't even know existed. The access road wasn't on any map, and the GPS signal cut out completely about 2 miles from the destination. I had to follow hand-drawn directions that took me through what looked like natural terrain, but was actually a carefully concealed approach to an underground complex. The client was waiting for me at what appeared to be a service entrance built into the mountainside. He was wearing civilian clothes, but he moved like military, and he examined my credentials more thoroughly than anyone had ever bothered to before. When he was satisfied that I was legitimate, he told me that the package I was delivering contained updated evacuation protocols for population consolidation zones. I asked him what that meant, and he gave me a look that was part pity and part something else I couldn't identify. He said that if things went the way the models were predicting, the government was going to have to make some very difficult decisions about resource allocation and population management. He handed me a business card with just a satellite phone number on it and told me that if I ever needed emergency assistance, I should call that number and identify myself as a contract courier. That should have been a red flag bigger than any I'd ever seen, but I was still thinking like the world was going to go back to normal eventually. I pocketed the card and focused on the immediate job, getting back to Denver and finding my next delivery. The ride back took longer than expected because visibility was getting worse. The ash was falling heavier now, and the temperature had dropped another 5 degrees since morning. My motorcycle's engine was working harder than usual, and I made a mental note to check the air filter when I got home. I'd always been good about maintaining my equipment, but now I was starting to think about what would happen if replacement parts became hard to find. By the time I got back to Denver, the city felt different. Not empty, but quieter. People were moving faster with more purpose, and there were fewer of them on the streets. The ones who were out were bundled up in clothes that belonged to October, not July. Store windows had signs about limited hours and restricted inventory. Gas stations had lines I'd never seen before, and some of them had signs saying they were limiting fuel purchases per customer. I called Maria to check for more jobs, and she sounded stressed in a way that made me realize this wasn't temporary anymore. She told me that half her regular clients had stopped answering their phones, and the ones who were still operating were asking about delivery services to locations outside the Denver metro area. Some were asking about delivery services to other states or even other countries. That night, I did something I'd never done before. I made a list of emergency supplies and started stockpiling them. Not because I thought the world was ending, but because my courier instincts were telling me that normal supply chains were about to become unreliable. I bought extra motorcycle parts, additional fuel containers, cold weather gear, non-perishable food, water purification tablets, and a backup communication system. I told myself I was just being practical, the same way I always kept emergency repair tools on my bike or carried extra cash for unexpected expenses. But deep down, I was starting to understand that the conversation I'd overheard at NORAD was more accurate than the reassuring statements government officials were making on television. My mother called that night from Tucson. She was worried about the weird weather patterns everyone was talking about, and she mentioned that food prices were going up faster than she'd ever seen. People were panic buying generators and camping equipment, and she wanted to know if I thought she should be concerned. I told her it was probably just temporary market anxiety, but I also told her it wouldn't hurt to have some extra supplies on hand. That was the last normal conversation I would ever have with her. The next morning, I got a call for what would turn out to be the strangest delivery of my career. The client wouldn't give me his name, just said he represented a private security concern and needed something transported to a facility in the mountains with absolute discretion. He was offering 5 times my normal rate, payment in advance, cash only. The pickup location was a warehouse district I'd never worked in before, and the package was a sealed briefcase that felt like it weighed about 20 pounds. The client gave me detailed directions to a location that wasn't on any map I'd ever seen, along with authentication codes and security protocols that sounded more like military operations than civilian business. He also gave me a satellite phone number and told me it was for emergencies only. If anything went wrong during the delivery, if I encountered any problems or obstacles, I was supposed to call that number immediately and report my status. He emphasized that this wasn't optional, and he made it clear that failure to follow the communication protocol would result in serious consequences. The destination was another underground facility, this one even more concealed than the previous mountain location. The access road required driving through what appeared to be private property, past multiple checkpoints with armed security, and finally to an entrance that looked like it had been carved directly into the mountainside. The receiving team was clearly military, despite wearing civilian clothes. They verified my identity using procedures that involved biometric scanners and background checks that took almost 30 minutes to complete. While I was waiting, I overheard conversations that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. People were talking about population consolidation zones, resource allocation protocols, and something called Phase 2. One person mentioned that they had updated intelligence about the volcanic winter timeline, and that previous estimates about recovery had been wildly optimistic. Another person said that urban population centers were going to become unviable within months, not years, and that evacuation planning needed to be accelerated immediately. When they finally accepted the briefcase, the receiving officer asked me if I understood the importance of discretion regarding everything I had seen and heard. I told him I understood, which was true. What I didn't tell him was that I was starting to piece together information from multiple deliveries, and the picture that was emerging was terrifying. The ride back to Denver took me through terrain that was already starting to look different. The ash was accumulating on the ground, turning everything gray and lifeless. The temperature had dropped so much that my breath was visible, and this was still July. Plants were starting to wilt and die, and I saw dead birds on the side of the road that had apparently fallen from the sky. I made it back to the city as the sun was setting, except the sun wasn't visible anymore. The sky was a uniform gray that stretched from horizon to horizon, and the artificial lights of Denver seemed dimmer and more isolated than they ever had before. Street lamps were coming on in the middle of what should have been daylight, and people were driving with their headlights on at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. That night, I sat in my apartment and tried to make sense of everything I'd seen and heard over the past few weeks. Government facilities preparing for massive population movements. Military personnel talking about urban areas becoming unviable. Clients paying premium rates for deliveries to locations that didn't officially exist. Emergency protocols being distributed to people who had security clearance I couldn't imagine. I realized that I'd been delivering pieces of a puzzle that painted a picture of complete social collapse. Not gradual decline, not economic hardship, but the kind of breakdown that happens when the basic assumptions that hold civilization together stop being true. The phone rang just after midnight. Maria's voice was shaking when she told me that she'd received word from several government clients that courier services were being suspended indefinitely. No explanation, no timeline for resumption, just immediate cessation of all delivery contracts. She said she was closing the dispatch office and advised me to make whatever preparations I thought were necessary for an extended period without regular work. I hung up the phone and looked around my apartment. Everything seemed normal, but I knew that normal was an illusion that was about to disappear forever. Outside my window, Denver looked like a city getting ready for winter, except it was July, and winter wasn't supposed to come for another 4 months. I spent the rest of that night loading my motorcycle with every piece of emergency equipment I could carry. Extra fuel, tools, communication gear, cold weather clothing, food, water, and the business cards with satellite phone, numbers that government clients had given me. I had no idea what I was preparing for, but my courier instincts were screaming that I needed to be ready to move at a moment's notice. As dawn broke over a city that looked nothing like the Denver I'd known my entire life, I realized that I'd just made my last official delivery. The world I'd built my career in, the network of clients and routes and reliable income that had defined my adult life, was disappearing faster than I could have imagined possible. But I still had my motorcycle. I still knew every shortcut and back road in Colorado, and I still had the skills that had made me the best courier in the region. I just had no idea how those skills were going to help me survive what was coming next. That morning, I heard the sound that would haunt me for the next 3 months. Somewhere in the distance, barely audible over the wind that was starting to carry ice crystals instead of dust, I heard the rumble of multiple motorcycle engines moving in formation. It was too organized to be coincidental, too purposeful to be recreational, and too early in the disaster for it to be anything good. I didn't know it yet, but those engines belonged to people who were going to hunt me across a frozen wasteland that used to be my home. People who understood that in a world where civilization had collapsed, The person who controlled transportation and communication controlled everything. The Ice Age had begun, and I was about to learn that surviving the cold was going to be the least of my problems. By August, it was snowing in Denver. In August, the temperature had dropped so far below normal that weather stations stopped trying to explain it as a temporary anomaly. The ash from Yellowstone had created a blanket across the entire sky that blocked out so much sunlight that plants were dying faster than anyone had predicted. The volcanic winter that government officials had called a minor climate disruption was turning into something that made scientists use words like catastrophic and unprecedented. My regular delivery business died along with everything else that required a functioning economy. Companies that had been my steady clients for years stopped answering their phones. Office buildings went dark as businesses either relocated or simply ceased operations. The dispatch office where Maria had coordinated jobs for dozens of couriers was abandoned, with nothing but a handwritten note on the door saying the service was suspended indefinitely. I found myself rationing fuel for the first time in my career. Every mile had to be planned and justified, because gas stations were either closed or charging prices that made filling my tank cost more than I used to make in a week. My modified Yamaha had always been my lifeline, but now it was becoming my most valuable possession in a world where transportation meant the difference between survival and freezing to death. The city itself was transforming in ways that made me realize how fragile our normal life had always been. Traffic lights went dark when the power grid started failing. Street lights stayed off even during the day because the sky was so dark that afternoon looked like evening. People moved differently, faster, and with more purpose, like they understood that being outside was now genuinely dangerous instead of just uncomfortable. I started using my courier skills for something I'd never imagined: scavenging. My intimate knowledge of Denver's office buildings, which had always helped me find the fastest routes between deliveries, became crucial for finding supplies that others couldn't locate. I knew which buildings had cafeterias with industrial-sized food storage, which offices kept emergency supplies, and which facilities had backup generators and fuel reserves. The first time I broke into an abandoned office building, I told myself it was just another delivery, except this time I was delivering supplies to myself. The building belonged to a consulting firm that had apparently evacuated without taking their emergency supplies. I found cases of bottled water, boxes of energy bars, first aid supplies, and even some cold weather gear that employees had left behind. But I wasn't the only one who'd figured out that empty buildings contained resources. I started encountering other people who had the same idea, and competition for supplies became a daily reality. Most of these encounters were peaceful, just people trying to survive who understood that everyone was in the same situation. But some were different. Some people had decided that desperation justified taking whatever they wanted from whoever was weaker. The power grid failed completely during the third week of August. Not all at once, but section by section, as rolling blackouts became permanent outages. The utility companies tried to maintain service to critical facilities like hospitals and government buildings, but even those efforts became sporadic and unreliable. When the last of the streetlights went dark, Denver became a different city entirely. You don't realize how much noise civilization makes until it goes completely quiet. No air conditioning units humming, no traffic noise, no electronic devices buzzing in the background. The silence was so complete that you could hear individual conversations from blocks away, which meant that anyone moving through the city had to assume they could be heard from much farther than normal. My encrypted satellite phone became my only connection to the outside world, and even that was becoming unreliable as communication infrastructure failed. But it was still functional enough for me to pick up emergency broadcasts and fragments of information from government frequencies. What I learned from those transmissions made me understand that what was happening in Denver was happening everywhere. The federal government was pulling back to what they called defendable positions, military bases, underground facilities, and locations that could be supplied and protected with minimal resources. Urban population centers were being written off as unsustainable, and there were no plans for large-scale civilian evacuation or assistance. We were on our own in the most literal sense possible. That's when I encountered David and his family. I was riding north on what used to be Interstate 25, looking for a medical supply warehouse that might still have useful inventory, when I saw their car broken down in the middle of what was becoming a blizzard. The family was standing beside their vehicle in clothing that belonged to autumn, not the deadly cold that August had become, and they were clearly not prepared for the situation they found themselves in. Every gallon of gas in my tank could mean the difference between living and dying. Every minute I spent helping them was a minute I wasn't using to secure my own survival. But something in my courier training kicked in. The part of me that had always made sure deliveries reached their intended recipients no matter what obstacles appeared along the way. I stopped and used my mechanical skills to diagnose their problem. The engine was clogged with ash that had gotten into the air intake, something that was happening to vehicles all over the region. I had spare filters and tools that could fix the issue, but using them meant giving up resources I might need later for my own motorcycle. David offered to pay me, but money was becoming meaningless in a world where you couldn't buy fuel or food at any price. Instead, he gave me something more valuable: information. He told me that he'd been monitoring emergency broadcasts on a ham radio system, and he'd picked up transmissions about government evacuation orders and something called consolidation zones. According to what David had heard, military forces were establishing secure areas where they could concentrate resources and maintain some level of organized society. But the criteria for admission to these zones were strict, and the locations were classified. Most civilians were being directed to temporary shelters that sounded more like refugee camps than actual assistance centers. David also mentioned that he'd heard references to organized groups that were forming outside the government system. People with military training or survival skills who were taking control of resources and establishing their own rules for who deserved protection and who didn't. Some of these groups were helping civilians, but others were described in terms that made them sound more like armed gangs than relief organizations. After I got their car running, David insisted on giving me the frequency information for the emergency broadcasts he'd been monitoring. He said that information was the most valuable currency in the new world we were all trying to navigate. He was right, but I didn't fully understand how right until I started listening to those transmissions myself. That night, I used David's frequency information to tune into emergency communications that I'd never known existed. What I heard confirmed everything I'd started to suspect during my government deliveries. Federal agencies were coordinating a controlled withdrawal from major population centers. Resources were being redirected to facilities that could maintain operations through what officials were calling an extended climate emergency. But the most disturbing information came from military frequencies that were discussing civilian population management. Terms like consolidation, screening, and resource allocation were being used in contexts that made it clear that not everyone was going to receive assistance. Decisions were being made about which groups of people were worth supporting and which were considered expendable. I also picked up communications from non-government sources that painted an even more troubling picture. Armed groups were forming across the region, some of them led by former military personnel who had decided that official evacuation plans were inadequate or too slow. These groups were establishing their own territories and their own rules, and they were recruiting members by offering protection and resources that the government couldn't provide. Over the next several days, I started connecting with other survivors using my communication equipment and courier experience. My informal network of drivers and messengers evolved into something like an intelligence system for people who were trying to survive outside the official government response. We shared information about supply locations, safe routes, dangerous areas, and groups of people who might be trustworthy allies. I met Sarah, a former EMT who had medical training that was desperately needed in a world where hospitals were closing and emergency services had stopped functioning. Marcus was a mechanic who could keep vehicles running with salvaged parts and improvised repairs. Alina was a teacher who was trying to keep her two young children alive, while schools were closed indefinitely and social services had disappeared. Each of these people had skills and knowledge that were valuable for survival, but none of them had the resources or equipment to make it on their own. My motorcycle and communication gear made me a natural coordinator for the group, but my independent nature made it difficult for me to commit to decisions that affected other people's safety. The group started meeting in abandoned sections of Denver's metro rail system, using tunnels and stations that provided shelter from the weather and concealment from anyone who might be monitoring surface activity. My knowledge of the underground infrastructure, gained from years of courier work that sometimes required navigating maintenance areas and service tunnels, became crucial for finding locations that were both safe and defensible. But even underground, we couldn't escape the reality that organized groups with better resources and equipment were operating in the area. We started finding evidence of camps that had been established and then abandoned, sometimes with signs of violence that suggested the former occupants hadn't left voluntarily. Tire tracks in the ash indicated that vehicles were moving through the region in organized patterns, like patrols or reconnaissance missions. Sarah, who had more experience than the rest of us with emergency situations, pointed out that we were seeing classic signs of territorial consolidation. Groups with superior resources were systematically clearing areas of potential competition, either by recruitment, intimidation, or elimination. She'd seen similar patterns during civil emergencies, but never on the scale that was developing across Colorado. Marcus made the practical observation that our small group couldn't defend itself against organized opposition with military training and equipment. Our survival depended on staying hidden and avoiding confrontation, but that strategy would only work as long as we could find resources without competing directly with more dangerous groups. Alina worried about her children, who were adapting to the situation better than she'd expected, but were also showing signs of stress that concerned her. She pointed out that children needed stability and safety that we couldn't guarantee, and she wondered whether we should try to make contact with official evacuation centers, even if the conditions there were reportedly poor. These conversations forced me to confront the limits of my independent approach to survival. I'd built my career on making my own decisions and accepting responsibility only for my own success or failure. But in a world where resources were scarce and threats were constant, individual survival might not be possible for anyone, no matter how skilled or prepared they were. The decision point came when we encountered evidence that our tunnel shelter had been discovered by someone else. We found footprints and equipment marks that indicated people had been exploring the area while we were away on supply runs. The tracks were too organized and purposeful to belong to random scavengers, and they showed signs of tactical awareness that suggested military or law enforcement training. We had to assume that our location was compromised and that whoever had found it would return with more people and better preparation. That meant we needed to evacuate immediately and find a new shelter, but it also meant that we were running out of safe options in the Denver area. Every abandoned building, every tunnel system, every potential refuge was either occupied by other groups or being monitored by people with resources we couldn't match. Sarah argued that we should try to make contact with one of the organized groups that we'd been hearing about on emergency frequencies. Some of them were reportedly accepting new members, and they could provide security and resources that we couldn't obtain on our own. But that would mean giving up our independence and accepting rules and leadership that we couldn't control. Marcus pointed out that my motorcycle and communication equipment made me valuable to any organized group, but that value might not extend to protecting the rest of our people if resources became even more scarce. Groups that were focused on survival might not want to support children or people without specialized skills that contributed directly to their operations. Alina said that her children's safety had to be the priority, even if that meant accepting conditions that weren't ideal for the adults in our group. She was willing to take risks with her own freedom if it meant her kids would have food, shelter, and protection through what was clearly going to be a long and dangerous winter. I realized that my courier experience had prepared me for many aspects of survival, but not for the responsibility of making decisions that affected other people's lives. When I was working alone, I could take calculated risks because I was the only one who would pay the price if something went wrong. But now I was part of a group where every choice I made could determine whether children lived or died. That night, while I was monitoring emergency frequencies, I picked up a transmission that changed everything. The mysterious satellite phone number that government clients had given me during my last official deliveries was being referenced in military communications as a contact point for civilian intelligence assets. Someone was coordinating with people like me, couriers and drivers who had access to information about civilian survival efforts. I used the secure phone to call the number, not sure what to expect or whether anyone would even answer. The voice that responded was crisp and professional, clearly military, and the person knew exactly who I was and what deliveries I'd made before the collapse began. They also knew that I was currently traveling with a small group of survivors and that we were operating in the Denver metro area. The caller identified herself as Colonel Patricia Hayes, and she told me that I'd been selected for possible inclusion in a civilian intelligence network that was monitoring survival group activities across the region. The government facilities I'd delivered to were part of a larger operation to maintain communication and coordination capabilities, even after official services had stopped functioning. Colonel Hayes offered me extraction to a secure government facility, where I could continue working as a courier and intelligence gatherer, but with official support and protection that would guarantee my survival through the crisis. The offer included regular meals, heated shelter, medical care, and equipment that would make my job safer and more effective. But the offer was only for me. My group members weren't considered essential personnel, and the extraction would have to happen immediately, without time for extended goodbyes or arrangements for their continued safety. I would have to choose between guaranteed personal survival and staying with people who had trusted me to help them navigate the crisis. I told Colonel Hayes that I needed time to consider the offer, and she gave me 24 hours to make a decision. She also warned me that organized groups in the area were becoming more aggressive about consolidating resources and eliminating competition. Military intelligence indicated that several survivor settlements had been attacked in recent days, and the pattern suggested that systematic clearing operations were being conducted by well-equipped forces. After I ended the call, I sat in the darkness of our tunnel shelter and tried to process what I'd learned. The government had capabilities and resources that I'd only glimpsed during my delivery work, but they were using those resources selectively, focusing on people and operations that served their strategic objectives rather than providing broad assistance to civilian survivors. At the same time, the organized groups that were forming outside government control were apparently becoming more dangerous and more willing to use violence to achieve their goals. We were caught between two forces that both had better equipment and more personnel than our small group could ever hope to match. Sarah pointed out that my government contact represented our best chance of connecting with resources that could help all of us, even if the initial offer was only for me. If I could establish credibility and demonstrate value as an intelligence asset, I might be able to negotiate for assistance or protection for the rest of the group later. Marcus took a more skeptical view, arguing that government agencies were focused on their own survival and would abandon civilian assets as soon as they became inconvenient or expensive to maintain. He'd seen how quickly official services had disappeared when the crisis began, and he didn't trust promises about future support. Alina was torn between wanting me to take the offer, because it would mean at least one person from our group would be safe, and worrying that losing my expertise and equipment would make survival much more difficult for everyone else. Her maternal instincts made her want to push me toward guaranteed safety, but her practical understanding of our situation made her realize how much we depended on my capabilities. I spent that night walking through sections of tunnel that were far enough from our shelter that I could think without disturbing anyone else's sleep. The decision felt like the most important choice I'd ever had to make, but every option involved abandoning either my principles or my responsibilities to people who trusted me. My father had been an independent trucker who valued his freedom above security or comfort. He disappeared rather than accept a job that would have tied him to one company and one set of roots, even though that job would have provided better pay and benefits for our family. I'd always thought he was selfish for choosing independence over responsibility, but now I was facing a similar choice under much more extreme circumstances. The next morning, I contacted Colonel Hayes and told her that I appreciated the offer but couldn't accept extraction without my group. She told me that she understood my position but couldn't extend the offer to include additional personnel. She also warned me that intelligence reports suggested that organized military-style groups were planning operations in the Denver area within the next few days. I asked her what kind of operations, and she said that the groups were reportedly planning to consolidate survivor settlements under centralized control, with forced recruitment for people who had useful skills and relocation to labor camps for those who didn't. Anyone who resisted these consolidation efforts was likely to be eliminated as a threat to organizational security. Colonel Hayes told me that if I changed my mind about extraction, I could contact her using the emergency satellite phone, but the offer wouldn't remain open indefinitely. Military resources were being redirected to other priorities, and civilian intelligence networks were being scaled back as the crisis progressed. After I ended the call, I gathered my group and shared what I'd learned, except for the details about the extraction offer. I told them that we needed to assume that more dangerous groups were operating in the area, and that our current survival strategy of avoiding confrontation might not be sustainable much longer. That afternoon, while I was conducting a reconnaissance run to check our supply routes, I heard the sound that I'd been dreading since the crisis began. Multiple motorcycle engines, running in formation, moving through the city with the kind of coordination that indicated military-style organization and discipline. The sound was too distant for me to see the vehicles, but it was close enough to confirm that Colonel Hayes' intelligence about organized groups was accurate. I used my knowledge of Denver's street layout to avoid the area where the engines seemed to be operating, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being hunted by people who understood urban tactics as well as I understood courier routes. For the first time since the crisis began, I felt like I was no longer the fastest or most knowledgeable person moving through the city. When I returned to our shelter, I found that my group had made contact with survivors from another settlement that had been attacked the previous night. 3 people had escaped from a community of about 20 that had been overrun by riders on motorcycles who'd given them an ultimatum: join their organization or be relocated to what they called a resource management facility. The survivors described the attackers as well-equipped former military personnel who moved with precision and spoke in terms that suggested they were part of a larger coordinated operation. They weren't random raiders or desperate scavengers. They were implementing a systematic plan to control survivor populations and resources across the region. One of the survivors recognized my description of the motorcycle sounds I'd heard earlier. She said that the same group had been conducting reconnaissance around their settlement for several days before the attack, using the same formation patterns and movement techniques. She warned me that if I'd heard them in our area, it meant we were probably already under surveillance, and that an approach or ultimatum would follow within a matter of days. That night, I realized that all of our survival strategies had been based on avoiding confrontation with other survivor groups. But we were now facing opposition that was actively hunting for settlements like ours. We couldn't hide from people who were conducting systematic searches, and we couldn't outrun vehicles that were as fast as mine and operated in coordinated groups. I also realized that the government extraction offer I'd turned down might have been the last chance for any of us to escape what was developing into a territorial war between organized factions. By choosing to stay with my group, I'd committed all of us to facing whatever came next without official protection or support. The sound of motorcycle engines was getting closer each day, and I was starting to understand that the skills that had made me successful as an independent courier might not be enough to keep me alive as a target of people who wanted to control everything I represented. My freedom of movement, my communication capabilities, and my knowledge of the region made me valuable to any group that wanted to dominate the area. But they also made me a threat to groups that couldn't recruit or control me permanently. The motorcycle engines I'd been hearing weren't random survivors trying to stay mobile in the frozen wasteland that Colorado had become. I discovered this when I decided to track the sound to its source, using my Courier knowledge of Denver's acoustic patterns to triangulate their location. What I found changed everything I thought I understood about who was actually in control of the post-collapse world. I followed the engine noise to a staging area in an abandoned shopping center parking lot, where I counted 23 motorcycles arranged in precise formation. The riders weren't desperate scavengers or panicked civilians trying to escape the cold. They moved with military discipline, wore matching gear that looked like it came from official sources, and communicated using hand signals that indicated professional training. Their leader was someone they called the captain, a man whose bearing and speech patterns made it clear he'd held actual military rank before the Yellowstone eruption changed everyone's circumstances. He was conducting what looked like a briefing, pointing to maps and giving instructions that his people received with the kind of attention that comes from genuine respect for authority, not just fear. I positioned myself where I could overhear fragments of their conversation, and what I learned made my blood run cold. They weren't just trying to survive the Ice Age. They were implementing a systematic plan to consolidate all survivor groups in the region under centralized control, with themselves as the organizing authority. They had detailed intelligence about settlement locations, resource caches, and the capabilities of different survivor groups. The captain was explaining to his people that they represented the only realistic hope for maintaining civilization through what he called the transition period. Government authorities had abandoned civilian populations to focus on protecting their own infrastructure, which meant that someone had to step in to provide organization and security for people who couldn't protect themselves. But their version of organization involved forced recruitment for anyone with useful skills and relocation to labor facilities for everyone else. People who resisted these consolidation efforts were classified as threats to community security, and threats were eliminated without negotiation. They weren't offering protection or assistance. They were implementing occupation. I learned that they called themselves the Network, and their operations extended far beyond Colorado. They had communication links with similar groups in surrounding states, all of them following the same consolidation protocols and reporting to some kind of regional command structure. This wasn't a local phenomenon. It was a coordinated effort to establish control over survivor populations across multiple states. The captain mentioned that they had inside information about government bunker locations and evacuation procedures, which explained how they'd been able to operate so effectively while official services were collapsing. Some of their intelligence was coming from sources within military and civilian government agencies, people who decided that the network's approach was more realistic than waiting for official rescue operations that weren't coming. During the briefing, the captain specifically mentioned that they'd identified several high-value targets in the Denver area, including someone described as an independent courier with communication equipment and detailed knowledge of regional transportation routes. That someone was me, and they knew more about my capabilities and recent activities than should have been possible for people I'd never encountered. I realized that my government deliveries before the collapse had put me on intelligence lists that were now being shared with groups like the network. My skills and equipment made me valuable to their operations, but my independence made me a threat to their control structure. They wanted to recruit me, but if recruitment failed, elimination was the alternative. The briefing concluded with assignments for surveillance and approach operations targeting specific survivor settlements, including detailed descriptions of the tunnel areas where my group had been sheltering. They knew where we were, how many people we had, what resources we possessed, and what skills each member of our group could contribute to their organization. I got out of there as quickly and quietly as possible, but I knew that our situation had become hopeless in terms of avoiding confrontation. The network wasn't going to ignore us or allow us to remain independent. They were coming for us, and they were prepared for resistance. When I returned to our tunnel shelter, I found my group in the middle of a heated discussion about whether we should try to negotiate with organized groups or attempt to relocate to a more remote area where we might avoid contact entirely. The survivors from the attacked settlement had been sharing details about the network's recruitment methods, and opinions were divided about how we should respond. Sarah argued that we should consider negotiating because the network appeared to have resources and organizational capabilities that could provide better security and survival prospects than we could achieve on our own. She pointed out that our current situation was unsustainable in the long term, and that joining a larger group might be our best chance of surviving the winter. Marcus took the opposite position, insisting that groups like the network were essentially military dictatorships that would exploit our skills while providing minimal benefits to anyone who wasn't part of their command structure. He'd seen how quickly official authority had disappeared when the crisis began, and he didn't trust people who claimed to represent legitimate organization while operating outside any accountable system. Alina was primarily concerned about her children's safety and was willing to consider any option that would provide them with food, shelter, and protection through the winter. But she was also worried about what kind of future her kids would have in a world controlled by people who used violence to enforce compliance with their rules. I shared what I'd learned about the network's operations and their specific interest in recruiting me, but I didn't mention that they'd already identified our location and were planning approach operations. I wanted my group to make decisions based on realistic assessment of our options rather than panic about immediate threats. The discussion continued through the night, but it became irrelevant when we received a radio transmission on emergency frequencies that was clearly intended for us. The captain's voice came through our communication equipment with an offer that was presented as negotiation, but delivered as an ultimatum. He said that the network was prepared to offer membership and protection to survivor groups that demonstrated value to their organizational objectives. People with medical training, mechanical skills, communication equipment, or specialized knowledge would be integrated into their operations with appropriate recognition of their contributions. Everyone else would be relocated to facilities where they could contribute to community survival through essential labor. The offer included guaranteed food, shelter, fuel, and security through the winter, plus access to medical care and communication with other network facilities across the region. But it also required surrendering all weapons, vehicles, and communication equipment to network control, and accepting work assignments that would be determined by organizational needs rather than personal preferences. The captain made it clear that this was a one-time offer with a 48-hour deadline for response. Groups that failed to respond or attempted to relocate to avoid contact would be classified as hostile to community security interests and would be dealt with accordingly. He emphasized that the network had the resources and intelligence capabilities to locate and engage any group in the region, regardless of their efforts to remain hidden. After the transmission ended, we sat in silence for several minutes while everyone processed what we just heard. The offer wasn't really negotiable, and the alternatives weren't really alternatives. We could join the network under their terms, or we could be eliminated as threats to their operations. Sarah pointed out that the medical training and EMT experience might give her a better position within their organization, and that Alina's teaching background could be valuable for their community development efforts. Marcus's mechanical skills were obviously essential for maintaining their vehicle fleet, but none of us knew what would happen to Alina's children, or whether families would be allowed to stay together under network management. I realized that my courier expertise and communication equipment made me a high-priority recruitment target, which meant that I might have more negotiating leverage than the others. But I also understood that my independence and knowledge of government contacts made me a potential security risk that the network might not be willing to tolerate, regardless of my value as an asset. Alina asked the question that we were all thinking. What would happen if we tried to escape to a more remote area where the network might not find us? I had to tell her that the briefing I'd overheard suggested they had intelligence sources and search capabilities that made successful evasion unlikely, especially for a group that included children and people without extensive wilderness survival experience. Marcus wanted to know if we could contact government authorities for protection or assistance, but my previous conversation with Colonel Hayes had made it clear that official resources were being reserved for people who could contribute directly to government operations. My group didn't meet the criteria for extraction or support, and requesting help might actually draw unwanted attention to our location. We spent the next day conducting reconnaissance and trying to gather additional information about network operations in our area. What we discovered confirmed that evasion wasn't a realistic option. They had teams conducting systematic searches of potential shelter locations, and they were using surveillance techniques that would detect our presence even if we relocated to areas that seemed completely isolated. I also learned that several other survivor groups had already accepted network recruitment offers, some voluntarily and others after their settlements had been surrounded and their alternatives eliminated. People who joined were reportedly receiving the resources and protection that had been promised, but they were also completely under network authority, with no option to leave or modify their arrangements. The surveillance teams were getting closer to our tunnel shelter, and it was becoming clear that they knew our general location and were conducting detailed reconnaissance to plan their approach operation. We could see evidence of their activities in areas we thought were secure, and we started finding equipment markers that indicated they were mapping our movement patterns and resource-gathering routes. That night, I made contact with Colonel Hayes using the emergency satellite phone, hoping to get additional intelligence about network operations or possible government assistance. What she told me eliminated any remaining illusions I had about our options. Colonel Hayes confirmed that the network was operating with the knowledge and unofficial approval of some government factions. Military and civilian authorities were struggling to maintain control over their own facilities and personnel, and they viewed groups like the network as a useful mechanism for managing civilian populations that they couldn't directly support or control. She also told me that intelligence reports indicated the network was preparing for what they called Phase 2 operations, which involved eliminating all independent survivor groups and consolidating control over resource distribution throughout the region. Phase 2 was scheduled to begin with large-scale operations designed to eliminate any remaining centers of resistance to network authority. Colonel Hayes offered me one final opportunity for extraction, but she emphasized that the offer had to be accepted immediately and couldn't be extended to include other members of my group. She also warned me that people who'd worked with government agencies before the collapse were being specifically targeted by network operations because they represented potential security risks and alternative sources of authority. I asked her what would happen to civilian survivors who weren't recruited by groups like the network, and her answer confirmed what I'd already started to suspect. Official government policy was to focus on preserving essential infrastructure and personnel, while allowing civilian populations to organize themselves according to whatever methods proved most effective. That meant abandoning people like my group to whatever fate groups like the network decided for them. After I ended the call, I realized that my courier experience with difficult clients and dangerous situations had prepared me for many things, but not for choosing between personal survival and loyalty to people who trusted me. Colonel Hayes was offering me guaranteed safety, but accepting would mean abandoning my group to face the network without the communication equipment and root knowledge that had been keeping them alive. I also realized that my government contacts and delivery experience made me more dangerous to the network than I'd initially understood. They couldn't afford to have someone with my background and capabilities operating independently in their territory, especially someone who might be able to contact government authorities or coordinate resistance activities. The next morning, we received another radio transmission from the captain, but this one was different from the recruitment offer. He said that network intelligence had determined that our group included someone with government connections who represented a potential security threat to their operations. He gave us 12 hours to identify and surrender this person, or the entire group would be classified as hostile and dealt with accordingly. I knew he was talking about me, and I knew that my group understood it too. Alina's expression made it clear that she was thinking about her children's safety, and that she was prepared to consider options that would protect them, even if those options weren't ideal for the adults in our group. Sarah pointed out that surrendering me might not actually protect the rest of the group, because the network had demonstrated that they were willing to eliminate anyone who might pose future problems for their authority. Marcus agreed, arguing that groups like the network couldn't afford to leave witnesses who might be able to testify about their methods if government authority was ever restored. But Alina asked the question that cut through all our tactical analysis. What were we actually fighting for, and was it worth the lives of her children? She said that if there was any chance that cooperation with the network would keep her kids alive through the winter, she had to consider that option seriously, regardless of what it meant for adult concepts like freedom and independence. I spent that afternoon conducting what I knew would be my final reconnaissance of the area, trying to identify options for escape routes or defensive positions that might give us alternatives to surrender or confrontation. What I discovered eliminated any remaining hope that we could avoid dealing with the network on their terms. They had teams positioned around our tunnel shelter in a pattern that would allow them to control all access points and escape routes. Their surveillance had been so thorough that they knew exactly how we'd been moving through the underground system, and they'd positioned their people to block every route we'd been using for supply runs and reconnaissance. I also found evidence that they'd been monitoring our radio communications, which meant they knew about my contacts with government authorities and had probably been listening to our internal discussions about response options. They understood our capabilities, our resources, our relationships, and our decision-making process better than we understood theirs. When I returned to our shelter, I found that Alina had made a decision that removed the choice from everyone else. She'd used our radio equipment to contact the captain and inform him that she was prepared to surrender herself and her children in exchange for guaranteed protection and support through the winter. She said that she couldn't continue to risk her kids' lives for principles that wouldn't keep them fed or warm. The captain responded that he appreciated her practical approach to the situation, but that the security concerns about our group couldn't be resolved by partial surrender. Everyone would need to accept network authority, or everyone would be classified as threats to community safety. He gave us until dawn to make a final decision. That night, I sat with my communication equipment and tried to decide whether to contact Colonel Hayes and accept extraction, knowing that doing so would probably trigger an immediate network assault on our position. I also considered whether there were any government or military frequencies I could use to call for assistance, even though I knew that official resources weren't being allocated to civilian rescue operations. I realized that my courier career had always been about connecting people with resources they needed, often in situations where official channels weren't available or reliable. But now I was facing a situation where the people who trusted me needed resources I couldn't provide and protection I couldn't guarantee. Alina approached me as I was monitoring emergency frequencies, and she told me that she understood the position I was in and didn't blame me for the choices I'd made. She said that her decision to surrender was about her children's immediate survival, not about judgment of the resistance that the rest of us were planning. She also told me that if I could find a way to escape and maintain contact with government authorities, I should do it, because someone needed to survive who could testify about what groups like the network were doing to civilian populations. She said that documentation and accountability might matter someday, even if they couldn't help us right now. Marcus took a different approach, arguing that we should use whatever time we had left to cause as much damage as possible to network operations, even if we couldn't escape or defeat them. He wanted to destroy equipment, sabotage vehicles, and create problems that would make their consolidation efforts more difficult and expensive. Sarah suggested that we should try to negotiate for better terms by demonstrating that we had information or capabilities that would be valuable to network operations. She thought that my government contacts and courier experience might give us leverage that we hadn't fully explored. As dawn approached, I realized that all of our options involved either surrender or destruction, and that my independent courier lifestyle had ended permanently regardless of which choice we made. The skills that had defined my adult life were either going to be used by the network for their purposes, or they were going to die with me in whatever confrontation was about to happen. The sound of motorcycle engines was getting closer, and I could hear them moving into position around our tunnel complex, with the precision that confirmed everything I'd learned about their military training and organizational capabilities. In a few hours, I was going to discover whether the root knowledge and survival skills that had kept me alive as a courier would be enough to keep me alive as a target of people who wanted to control everything I represented. When dawn broke over our tunnel shelter, I knew that conventional resistance would get us all killed within hours. The network had superior numbers, better equipment, military training, and detailed intelligence about our location and capabilities. But my courier experience had taught me something that military planners sometimes overlooked. The most effective strategy isn't always direct confrontation. Sometimes the best approach is to make your opponent think they're winning, while you work toward completely different objectives. I developed a plan that required me to do something I'd never done in my career: deliberately deceive people who trusted me. The strategy was to fake surrender and integration with the network, while secretly organizing an escape operation that would save my group and potentially disrupt their consolidation efforts across the region. It was the kind of double dealing that I'd seen clients attempt with each other, but never something I'd tried myself. The plan required precise timing and careful management of information. I would need to convince the captain that I was genuinely surrendering, while secretly maintaining contact with my group and coordinating resistance activities. My courier experience with managing conflicting loyalties and sensitive information would be crucial, but the stakes were higher than any delivery job I'd ever handled. When the captain's voice came over our radio at exactly 7 o'clock, offering final terms for surrender, I responded by requesting a face-to-face meeting to discuss integration procedures. I told him that my group was prepared to accept network authority, but that I wanted to understand exactly what would be expected of us and what protections would be provided in return. The captain agreed to meet me at a neutral location in 1 hour, with the understanding that any attempt at deception or resistance would result in immediate assault on our tunnel shelter. He specified that I should come alone and unarmed, and that our conversation would determine the fate of everyone in my group. I used that hour to brief my group on the deception plan, emphasizing that their survival depended on convincing network personnel that they genuinely accepted the integration offer. Sarah, Marcus, and Alina would need to demonstrate enthusiasm for joining the organization while secretly preparing for evacuation when I gave them the signal. The most difficult part was explaining to Alina that her children would need to act normally around network personnel while we organized their escape. I told her that the deception was our only chance of getting them to safety, but that it required everyone to perform convincingly under circumstances that were genuinely dangerous. I met the captain at the ruins of a gas station that provided clear sight lines in all directions. He was exactly what I'd expected from listening to his radio communications. A man whose military bearing and tactical awareness made it clear that he'd held genuine authority before the collapse. But he was also someone who'd adapted to post-collapse realities in ways that suggested he understood the difference between official military procedures and practical survival requirements. The captain began by acknowledging my reputation as a courier and expressing appreciation for my communication equipment and route knowledge. He said that the network needed people with my skills to coordinate supply operations and maintain contact between their various facilities. He offered me a position as Chief Transportation Coordinator, with authority over vehicle maintenance and supply route planning. The offer included immediate access to fuel, spare parts, and communication equipment that would make my job more effective and safer. I would be responsible for organizing supply runs between network facilities, coordinating with transportation teams in other regions, and maintaining the intelligence database they used to track survivor groups and resource locations. In exchange, I would surrender my motorcycle and satellite phone to network control, accept housing and work assignments determined by organizational needs, and submit to security protocols that included regular reporting on my activities and contacts. I would also be expected to provide detailed information about government delivery routes and facility locations from my pre-collapse courier work. The captain made it clear that the offer was contingent on my group's complete integration into network operations. Sarah would work in their medical facility, Marcus would join their vehicle maintenance team, Alina would help establish educational programs for children, and her kids would be enrolled in network community schools. He also explained that integration was permanent. People who joined the network couldn't leave or transfer to other organizations because they would have access to sensitive information about operations and capabilities that couldn't be allowed to reach potential enemies. Security was maintained through complete commitment to network objectives and zero tolerance for disloyalty or resistance. I accepted the offer immediately, expressing enthusiasm for the opportunity to use my courier skills for community benefit rather than individual profit. I told the captain that my group had been struggling with resource management and security issues that the network could resolve, and that we were grateful for the chance to contribute to something larger than our own survival. The captain seemed satisfied with my response, but he also made it clear that he understood the risks involved in recruiting someone with my background and capabilities. He said that network security protocols would monitor my activities closely during the integration period, and that any indication of disloyalty or deception would result in immediate termination of my position and elimination of security risks to the organization. I returned to our tunnel shelter with a network escort team that would oversee our relocation to their facility. I had to convince my group to cooperate with the escort while secretly communicating that the deception plan was active and that they should prepare for escape operations without alerting our guards. The network facility was more sophisticated than I'd expected. They'd established their base in a former National Guard armory that provided vehicle maintenance capabilities, communication equipment, and defensible housing for several hundred people. The organization was clearly more advanced and better resourced than any survivor group I'd encountered. During my first day as transportation coordinator, I gained access to network communication systems and discovered that their operations were even more extensive than I'd realized. They had facilities in 5 states, with coordination protocols that allowed them to share intelligence, transfer personnel, and coordinate supply operations across the entire region. They weren't just a local survival group. They were implementing a systematic plan to control post-collapse society across multiple states. I also learned that they had intelligence sources within government facilities, including some of the bunkers where I'd made deliveries before the collapse. Network leadership was receiving real-time information about government evacuation plans, resource allocation decisions, and military deployment schedules. They knew which areas were being abandoned by official authorities and which locations contained valuable supplies or equipment. My position as transportation coordinator gave me access to detailed maps of their supply routes, facility locations, and operational schedules. I also had communication authority that allowed me to contact other network facilities and coordinate with transportation teams across the region. This access was exactly what I needed to organize resistance activities, but using it required extreme caution to avoid detection by their security monitoring. Lieutenant Torres was assigned as my handler and supervisor during the integration period. He was a former military intelligence officer who understood surveillance and counter-surveillance techniques better than most people understood basic communication. He monitored my radio transmissions, reviewed my route planning, and observed my interactions with other network personnel. Torres made it clear that he was suspicious of my rapid integration and apparent enthusiasm for network objectives. He told me that people with government connections often had difficulty accepting the reality that official authority wasn't coming back, and that some of them attempted to maintain unauthorized contacts with former colleagues or agencies. I had to demonstrate genuine value to network operations while secretly gathering intelligence that could be used against them. I used my Courier experience with route optimization to improve their supply efficiency, which gained credibility with network leadership. I also provided information about government facility locations that they could verify through their own intelligence sources. But I was also using my communication access to contact survivor groups in other areas, warning them about network consolidation efforts and providing intelligence about their operational capabilities. I used coded language and emergency frequencies that Torres wouldn't normally monitor, but I knew that discovery was inevitable if I maintained these activities for too long. The breakthrough came when I discovered that network operations were being coordinated through a centralized communication hub that controlled their entire regional network. If that hub could be disrupted or destroyed, their ability to coordinate between facilities would be severely compromised, potentially creating opportunities for resistance activities that were currently impossible. I also learned that they were planning Phase 2 operations to begin within 2 weeks. Phase 2 involved systematic elimination of all remaining independent survivor groups, using intelligence gathered during their recruitment efforts to identify and destroy any centers of potential resistance to network authority. Once Phase 2 was complete, they would control all resources and personnel in the region. Marcus had been assigned to their vehicle maintenance facility, where he discovered that network equipment included military-grade communication gear and weapons that had obviously been obtained through official channels. Some of their vehicles were clearly government property that had been repurposed for network operations. Their resources suggested direct cooperation with military or civilian authorities, not just informal intelligence sharing. Sarah was working in their medical facility, where she learned that network treatment protocols included psychological evaluation and behavior modification for people who showed signs of resistance to organizational authority. Medical personnel were required to report on patient attitudes and recommend intervention for people who expressed doubts about network policies or leadership. Alina had been assigned to their education program, where she discovered that children were being taught that network authority was legitimate government, and that resistance to organizational rules was equivalent to treason against community safety. The curriculum emphasized loyalty to network leadership and acceptance of resource allocation decisions made by people with better information and training than individual families possessed. Alina also learned that families weren't guaranteed to remain together under network management. Children who showed aptitude for specialized skills were transferred to facilities where they could receive advanced training, and parents who were assigned to different locations were expected to prioritize organizational needs over family relationships. After a week of integration, I realized that our escape window was closing rapidly. Network security protocols were becoming more restrictive as my value to their operations increased, and TORS was implementing surveillance measures that would make unauthorized communication impossible. I also discovered that Phase 2 planning included specific provisions for eliminating recently recruited personnel who might pose security risks if they attempted to leave or resist. I used my transportation coordinator authority to plan a supply run that would take me outside the network facility with minimal supervision. The route I proposed would allow me to contact survivor groups in areas that weren't under network control, warning them about Phase 2 operations and potentially organizing coordinated resistance activities. But TORS denied approval for the supply run, citing security concerns about allowing recently recruited personnel to operate outside direct supervision. He told me that my integration period would need to be extended until network leadership was satisfied that I posed no security risks to their operations. That night, I used emergency communication frequencies to contact Colonel Hayes, hoping to coordinate government assistance for resistance activities. What she told me eliminated any remaining hope that official authorities would intervene to protect civilian survivors from network consolidation efforts. Colonel Hayes confirmed that some government factions were actively supporting network operations as the most practical method for managing civilian populations that couldn't be directly assisted or controlled. Military resources were focused on protecting essential infrastructure and personnel, and civilian resistance to network authority was viewed as destabilizing to regional security objectives. She also told me that intelligence reports indicated network leadership was planning to eliminate government contacts like me who might represent alternative sources of authority or resistance coordination. My courier background and knowledge of government facilities made me too dangerous to their long-term security to allow me to remain alive, regardless of my value as a transportation coordinator. Colonel Hayes offered me immediate extraction if I could reach a pickup location outside network territory, but she emphasized that the offer couldn't be extended to include my group members. She also warned me that extraction operations were being scaled back as government priorities shifted to other regions, and that this might be the last opportunity for assistance. I realized that accepting extraction would abandon my group to whatever fate network leadership decided for them, but refusing would likely result in my elimination and leave them without any chance of outside assistance. My courier experience had never involved choices where every option meant abandoning people who trusted me. I made the decision to reject extraction and instead use my remaining time and access to organize the most comprehensive resistance operation possible. If I was going to be eliminated anyway, I could at least try to disrupt network operations severely enough to give other survivor groups a chance to escape or resist. I used my transportation coordinator access to download detailed intelligence about network facilities, supply routes, communication protocols, and Phase 2 operational plans. I copied everything onto portable storage devices that I could transmit to survivor groups using emergency communication equipment. I also identified vulnerabilities in their centralized communication system that could be exploited to disrupt coordination between facilities. If multiple network installations lost communication capability simultaneously, their ability to implement coordinated operations would be severely compromised. The plan required sacrificing my cover and accepting certain elimination, but it also offered the possibility of preventing network consolidation efforts across the entire region. My courier experience had taught me that sometimes the most important delivery is the one that costs you everything to complete. Torres confronted me the next morning with evidence that I'd been accessing communication systems outside my assigned authority. He said that network security had been monitoring all communication traffic and had detected unauthorized transmissions that appeared to contain coded intelligence about their operations. He gave me 2 hours to provide complete information about my resistance activities and unauthorized contacts, with the promise that cooperation would result in quick elimination rather than extended interrogation. He made it clear that my group members would be subject to enhanced security measures until network leadership determined their involvement in my activities. I used those 2 hours to complete transmission of intelligence to every survivor group frequency I could reach. I provided detailed information about network facilities, operational capabilities, leadership structure, and Phase 2 plans. I also transmitted the communication system vulnerabilities I'd identified and instructions for coordinated resistance operations. The response was immediate and more extensive than I'd hoped. Survivor groups across Colorado began coordinating attacks on network supply depots, communication installations, and transportation routes. The intelligence I'd provided allowed them to target the most critical vulnerabilities in network operations, creating disruption that spread faster than network leadership could respond. Torres returned with orders for my immediate elimination, but he also brought news that network facilities across the region were under coordinated attack and that their communication systems were being systematically disrupted. He said that network leadership held me responsible for coordinating the resistance activities, and that my elimination would be public as an example to other potential resistors. But the coordinated attacks had created enough chaos that security protocols were breaking down. Network personnel were being reassigned to defensive operations, communication systems were unreliable, and transportation schedules were disrupted by attacks on supply routes. The organization that had seemed invincible a week earlier was struggling to maintain basic operational effectiveness. I used the confusion to coordinate with Marcus and Sarah for an escape attempt that would take advantage of security breakdowns caused by the resistance activities. Alina's children would be the most difficult part of the escape, but the chaos provided cover that wouldn't be available under normal circumstances. The captain personally supervised my extraction from the transportation facility, clearly intending to make my elimination an example that would discourage other resistance activities. But he was also dealing with multiple crisis situations that divided his attention and resources. As we were leaving the facility, I heard radio reports of successful attacks on network installations across the region. Survivor groups had used the intelligence I'd provided to coordinate operations that were disrupting network capabilities faster than they could be repaired or replaced. The systematic consolidation effort that had seemed unstoppable was collapsing under coordinated resistance that they hadn't anticipated or prepared for. The captain told me that my resistance activities had accelerated Phase 2 operations, and that network forces were implementing emergency protocols to eliminate all potential security threats, including recently recruited personnel who might have been involved in intelligence gathering. But he also acknowledged that the resistance had been more effective than network planning had anticipated. As we approached the location where my elimination was scheduled to occur, I realized that my courier career had ended exactly the way it began, with a delivery that would determine whether people lived or died. The difference was that this time, the package was information, the client was every survivor trying to stay free, and the delivery route led through my own destruction to something that might be worth the cost. The intelligence I'd transmitted to survivor groups across Colorado created a cascade of coordinated attacks that overwhelmed the network's ability to respond effectively. Within hours of my broadcasts, their supply depots were burning, communication towers were destroyed, and transportation routes were blocked by coordinated sabotage operations. The systematic consolidation effort that had seemed unstoppable was collapsing under resistance they hadn't anticipated. Radio reports coming through emergency frequencies painted a picture of network facilities under siege across the entire region. Survivor groups that had been hiding or preparing for forced recruitment were instead launching offensive operations, using the detailed intelligence about vulnerabilities and operational schedules that I'd provided. The hunters had become the hunted, and the network was discovering that controlling scattered civilian populations was much more difficult than they'd calculated. The captain was receiving constant updates about attacks on network installations, and his responses revealed how completely the coordinated resistance had disrupted their operations. Facilities that had been secure the previous day were reporting equipment destruction, personnel casualties, and complete breakdown of coordination with regional command structures. The centralized control system that had made the network effective was becoming a liability when every node in their network was under simultaneous attack. But the success of the resistance operations also meant that network leadership was implementing emergency protocols designed to eliminate security threats and preserve essential personnel and resources. Phase 2 operations were being accelerated, and elimination procedures were being applied to anyone who might pose future risks to organizational survival. That included recently recruited people like my group members, who now represented potential intelligence assets for resistance activities. Tours informed me that Marcus, Sarah, and Alina had been classified as security risks and scheduled for immediate elimination along with me. Their integration into network operations had provided them with detailed knowledge about facilities, personnel, and procedures that could be valuable to resistance groups. Network security couldn't afford to allow that information to reach people who were actively attacking their installations. I realized that my deception plan had failed to protect my group, but it had succeeded in creating something much larger and more important. The resistance activities spreading across Colorado were giving thousands of survivors the opportunity to remain free and independent, instead of being forced into network consolidation facilities. My courier skills had been used for the most important delivery of my career, information that allowed people to fight for their own survival. The elimination was scheduled to take place at a central location where network leadership could demonstrate their authority and discourage further resistance activities. But the constant reports of successful attacks on their facilities were making it clear that public displays of power weren't going to restore their control over the situation. The resistance had reached a scale and effectiveness that required military-style response operations rather than intimidation tactics. As we were being transported to the elimination site, I heard radio communications indicating that some network facilities were being abandoned as their defensive positions became untenable. Personnel were being consolidated to more defensible locations, and resources were being redirected to essential operations rather than expansion activities. The organization that had been planning regional domination was now focused on institutional survival. Marcus had been working in their vehicle maintenance facility when the resistance attacks began, and he'd used the chaos to sabotage critical transportation equipment that network forces needed for coordination and supply operations. His mechanical expertise had allowed him to disable vehicles in ways that would require extensive repairs, using parts and expertise that weren't available under emergency conditions. Sarah had been in their medical facility when elimination orders were issued, and she'd used her EMT training to treat personnel injured during resistance attacks while secretly gathering intelligence about network casualties and resource limitations. Her medical access had revealed that their organization was much more vulnerable to sustained resistance than their leadership had admitted. Alina had been with her children in the education facility when security protocols were implemented, and she'd used her teaching experience to coordinate with other parents and children to resist separation procedures. The family unity that network policies were designed to eliminate had become a source of organized resistance within their own facilities. The transportation route to the elimination site took us through areas where resistance attacks had been most successful, and the evidence of coordinated sabotage was visible everywhere. Communication towers were destroyed, supply depots were burning, and abandoned network vehicles indicated that their personnel were either casualties or had fled to more secure positions. But I also noticed that the resistance attacks were following tactical patterns that suggested coordination beyond what individual survivor groups could have achieved on their own. Someone with military training and strategic planning experience was organizing operations that maximized damage to network capabilities while minimizing exposure to counterattack. The intelligence I'd provided was being used by people who understood how to conduct effective asymmetric warfare. The captain received a radio transmission ordering him to abort the elimination procedure and return immediately to defend the primary network facility. Intelligence reports indicated that coordinated resistance forces were planning a major assault on their command center, and all available personnel were needed for defensive operations. My elimination was being postponed in favor of organizational survival priorities. This change in plans created the opportunity I'd been hoping for since the deception began. Network security protocols were breaking down under the pressure of coordinated attacks. Personnel were being reassigned to crisis response duties, and transportation schedules were disrupted by the need to defend multiple facilities simultaneously. The chaos provided cover for escape operations that would have been impossible under normal circumstances. I used my Courier knowledge of the transportation route to identify an opportunity for escape during a vehicle maintenance stop. The driver needed to refuel and check equipment that had been damaged during a resistance attack on their supply convoy, and the security team was distracted by radio reports of attacks on other network positions. Marcus recognized the escape opportunity at the same time I did, and he used his mechanical knowledge to create a vehicle malfunction that required immediate attention from our guards. While they were focused on diagnosing the problem, Sarah used her medical training to create a distraction that drew additional personnel away from our immediate area. Alina gathered her children and followed the escape route that we discussed during our integration planning, using her teaching experience to keep them calm and coordinated during the chaos. The family unity that network policies had tried to eliminate became the foundation for successful resistance to their authority. The escape took us through terrain that I knew from my courier work, but the Ice Age conditions had changed the landscape in ways that made familiar routes dangerous and unpredictable. Streams were frozen solid, roads were blocked by snow and debris, and visibility was limited by weather conditions that made navigation much more difficult than normal. But my courier experience with emergency route planning allowed me to adapt to the changed conditions and find paths that avoided areas where network forces might be conducting search operations. We used abandoned buildings, service tunnels, and maintenance areas that provided shelter and concealment, while we moved toward areas where resistance groups were reportedly operating. The journey took 3 days of careful movement through terrain that was both familiar and completely transformed by the volcanic winter. My courier knowledge of Denver's infrastructure was still valuable, but the Ice Age had created new obstacles and eliminated resources that had always been reliable. Survival required constant adaptation to conditions that changed faster than any planning could anticipate. We made contact with resistance forces that were operating out of facilities in the mountains west of Denver, where natural terrain provided defensive advantages and geothermal features offered heat sources that didn't depend on fuel supplies. The resistance network had evolved into something much more sophisticated than the scattered survivor groups that had existed before network consolidation efforts began. The resistance leadership included former military personnel who'd rejected network authority, civilian specialists who'd escaped from government facilities, and survivor group leaders who'd been coordinating opposition activities across the region. They'd used the intelligence I'd provided to develop comprehensive operations that were disrupting network capabilities faster than they could be restored. Colonel Hayes had also made contact with resistance forces, representing a government faction that opposed network consolidation methods and supported civilian autonomy in post-collapse society. Her faction was providing limited assistance to resistance operations, including communication equipment and intelligence about government resources that could be accessed by legitimate civilian authorities. The resistance operations had been more successful than anyone had anticipated, but they'd also revealed the scale of network operations and the extent of their resources. The organization we'd been fighting was part of a multi-state network that included government personnel, military units, and civilian groups that had decided centralized authority was the only realistic approach to post-collapse survival. Network forces were regrouping in more defensible positions and implementing counter-resistance operations designed to eliminate the coordination that had made survivor opposition so effective. They were abandoning expansion activities in favor of consolidating control over core territories, where they could maintain security and resource production without constant threat of sabotage. But the resistance had also demonstrated that independent survivor communities could coordinate effective operations when they had access to accurate intelligence and communication capabilities. The network of autonomous groups that was emerging from successful resistance activities represented a different model for post-collapse society than either government bunkers or network consolidation facilities. My role in the resistance evolved from intelligence provider to communication coordinator, using my Courier experience with route planning and network management to maintain contact between survivor communities across the region. The skills that had defined my pre-collapse career were directly applicable to coordinating resistance activities and building the foundation for autonomous community networks. Sarah's medical training became crucial for treating resistance casualties and establishing health care capabilities that didn't depend on centralized facilities. Marcus's mechanical expertise was essential for maintaining equipment and vehicles that resistance groups needed for transportation and communication. Alina's teaching experience helped develop education programs that prepared children for life in autonomous communities rather than centralized authority systems. The resistance network was discovering that post-collapse survival didn't require accepting centralized control or abandoning civilian autonomy. Communities that maintained communication and coordination capabilities could provide mutual assistance and security without surrendering independence to organizations like the network or government bunkers that demanded complete submission to their authority. Colonel Hayes provided updates about government faction activities that revealed the extent of disagreement within official institutions about appropriate responses to post-collapse conditions. Some factions supported network-style consolidation as the most efficient approach to resource management, while others believed that civilian autonomy was essential for maintaining democratic values through the crisis period. The government factions that supported civilian autonomy were providing assistance to resistance networks, but their resources were limited, and their authority was disputed by factions that viewed independent survivor communities as security threats that needed to be eliminated or controlled. The political struggle within government institutions was as complex and dangerous as the survival struggle in civilian communities. Network counter-resistance operations were becoming more sophisticated and aggressive as their leadership recognized that coordinated civilian opposition represented an existential threat to their organizational model. They were implementing systematic elimination procedures for resistance leadership and conducting operations designed to destroy communication capabilities that allowed survivor communities to coordinate activities. But the resistance network had evolved beyond dependence on individual leaders or centralized communication systems. The intelligence and coordination methods that I'd helped establish had been distributed across multiple communities that could maintain operations even when specific nodes were eliminated or compromised. The network had become resilient in ways that made systematic destruction much more difficult than network leadership had anticipated. The success of resistance operations was also attracting support from survivor communities that had previously been neutral or undecided about whether to resist network consolidation. Communities that had been preparing to accept forced recruitment were instead organizing defensive operations and requesting assistance with resistance planning and coordination. The scale of resistance activities was approaching the level where network operations were becoming unsustainable rather than merely difficult. Their resource requirements for maintaining control over contested territory were exceeding their capacity to generate those resources through the consolidation activities that had funded their expansion. The economic model that had made network operations feasible was breaking down under the pressure of sustained resistance. Reports from other states indicated that similar resistance networks were developing wherever network consolidation efforts had been implemented. The intelligence and coordination methods that had proven successful in Colorado were being adapted to local conditions in other regions, creating a pattern of opposition that threatened network operations across their entire multi-state territory. Colonel Hayes informed me that government factions supporting civilian autonomy were gaining influence within official institutions, as evidence accumulated that network consolidation methods were creating more problems than they solved. Military and civilian authorities were recognizing that communities with strong resistance capabilities were also more effective at resource production and security operations than communities under centralized control. The resistance success was also creating opportunities for communication and trade between survivor communities that had been isolated since the collapse began. Routes that I'd helped establish for resistance coordination were being used for resource sharing and mutual assistance activities that strengthened community capabilities and reduced dependence on external authority. Alina's children were adapting to life in autonomous communities with resilience that demonstrated the effectiveness of community-based education and support systems. They were learning skills and values that prepared them for independence and cooperation rather than submission to centralized authority, representing the possibility that post-collapse society could maintain democratic principles and civilian autonomy. My Courier experience was evolving into something broader and more significant than transportation and communication coordination. The network of relationships and capabilities that I'd helped build was becoming the foundation for a different model of post-collapse society, one that preserved individual freedom and community autonomy while providing the coordination and mutual assistance necessary for survival and recovery. The resistance had succeeded in preventing network consolidation of the Colorado region, but the larger struggle between centralized control and civilian autonomy was continuing across multiple states and within government institutions. The ice age that had triggered the collapse was also beginning to show signs of gradual change, with weather patterns suggesting that volcanic winter conditions might be stabilizing rather than continuing to deteriorate. 3 months after the Yellowstone eruption had changed everything, survivor communities across Colorado were not just surviving, but building something new and different from what had existed before the collapse. The crisis had eliminated many of the institutions and systems that had defined normal life, but it had also created opportunities for developing community structures that were more resilient and democratic than what they replaced. My role as a courier had evolved from delivering packages between clients to coordinating communication between communities that were building the foundation for post-collapse society. The routes I traveled were still dangerous, and the deliveries were still critical, but the purpose had changed from individual profit to community survival and the preservation of values that made survival worthwhile. The motorcycle routes that had defined my career were becoming the communication networks that connected autonomous communities across a region that was slowly adapting to Ice Age conditions and building new forms of organization that combined individual freedom with collective responsibility. The skills that had made me effective as an independent courier were directly applicable to the challenges of maintaining civilian autonomy and democratic cooperation in a world where both were under constant threat. The delivery never really ends. The destination just keeps changing, and the cargo becomes more important with every mile traveled. In a world where survival depends on connection and cooperation, someone always needs to carry messages between people who are building something better than what they lost.